Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at this webinar on using case study and case-based methodology in evaluation. My name is Carlos Tarazona. I work in FO, and I'm today together with some colleagues who are also members of the UNEG Methods Working Group. I will kindly ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. But before we start, let me thank our Dr. Linda Moras, who is the co-founder of EPE and also the former Chief Evaluation Officer for the World Bank, who is going to be our main speaker at today's session. So please, colleagues.
Yeah, my name is Elisabetta Pegurri, and I am Senior Advisor at for Evaluation at UNEG. And it was a real pleasure to be in this group because of the key role that case study plays in our evaluations. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francesca Carini, and I work as Evaluation Analyst at the UNEG office.
Good morning, good afternoon. Greetings from Paris. My name is Taipei Dlamini. I'm an evaluation officer at UNESCO, and I'm very pleased to be participating in this working group on methods at UNEG, and to have Dr. Linda Mora Imes also participate in this endeavor. Case studies are very important for us, so it's always crucial to discuss this point. Thank you.
Yes. So, Dr. Linda Mora, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Greetings in whatever time zone you find yourself.
So, colleagues, we will be starting with the word association game. Some of you have already started inputting. You're free to enter up to 5 words. You can put as many as you can think of. But we already have a few keywords popping up.
Some of the characteristics of case studies that we're going to be talking about are clearly reflected here. So welcome all of you, and I'm so glad that you're interested in case study methodology. I think we use what we call case studies all the time in our work, but we often don't use good case study methodology. We don't know it to use it. So that's what I hope to share today, and to have you understand the difference between case studies and case-based approaches, which is important, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. We'll also talk about how to design a good case study, what we mean by case study as an approach, as a method or a methodology. There's also something I always find some confusion when I teach case studies, because some people think that I'm going to be teaching about how to write, how to develop and write a good teaching evaluation case study. And if that's what you've signed up for, you'll be disappointed, because we're not going to be talking about how to write a good teaching case study and evaluation. We're going to be focusing on how to design a better case study. So I hope that's what you signed up for. And we'll be talking a little bit about key principles of case study and case-based analysis, because how you analyze the data in a case study is a specific kind of protocol, and we'll touch on it today. And we'll talk about the key issues of case studies, causality, and generalizability. I have never tried to teach this in an hour and a half. This is usually at least a full day workshop. So this will be a little bit of a challenge, but we'll cover as much as we can. A key here, before I get into the definition, Usually I like to have people vote on this, but I'm just going to briefly talk about it. And then the whole rest of the presentation is going to talk really about these 4 points. 1, do case studies take a long time? And I noticed that was one of the comments in the word game that we just played. Long time consuming. Not necessarily. We'll talk more about that. Case studies use only qualitative methods. No, you can actually do random sampling within a case study if you would want to. But it is true that case studies use predominantly qualitative methods. 3, case studies provide little basis for generalization, true or false. Well, most people are going to say, oh no, you can't generalize from a case study. But again, we have to nuance that, and we'll be discussing this further. And the big one, case studies are nice to do, but you can't draw any causal inferences from them. True or false? False. Actually, you can use case studies to draw causal inferences pretty well. So we're going to continue on, and we will be discussing these 4 myths or facts. So this is the classic definition of case study, at least when it comes to evaluation. A case study is a method of learning about a complex instance based on a comprehensive understanding of that instance, obtained through extensive description and analysis of that instance. And this is critical, taken as a whole and in its context. That's a mouthful. It's a huge definition. And we sort of try to parse it a little bit here to make it clearer. If you're doing road project number 7, you probably don't need to do a case study. Right? There's not that much that isn't already known. You can just use some kind of, descriptive methodology. You can just use a more normative based approach. You don't really need a case study. You've done it 6 other times. It's mostly a question of meeting the standards. There's not a lot of doubt whether this will be accomplished. Maybe you don't need to use a case study. But where we have a complex instance, many factors operating in the environment, many things that could result in the changes that we're seeking besides our program, besides our intervention, case studies are good for understanding complexity. And as a field, we have more and more come to understand that often we operate in a very complex environment, lots of things going on in it. And it's sometimes misleading to assume in a pre-post kind of way that it was our intervention that made the difference that we're seeing. So case studies can be very helpful in being convincing that yes, it was our intervention that is clearly resulting in this outcome. Based on a comprehensive understanding, well, we're going to talk about that in, I think, the next slide. Yes, we want to be as comprehensive as we can. If we're doing a series of fly-throughs, we've got 3 days to spend at each site, we probably don't have a case study because there's no way that we can have that comprehensive understanding in a 3-day period. That's just not enough. And if we just ask, we're coming, so local office, please set up some meetings with us. And please, if you could put together some beneficiaries for us. If you're using that kind of approach, you don't have a case study. All right. Obtained through extensive description and analysis. Yes, thick, descriptions. Thick descriptions and analysis of that thick description is part of doing case studies. And as I talked about, they're mostly qualitative, but you can use more quantitative methods within them, and we'll be talking about that. Taken as a whole and in its context, this one I think is very important because this is at the heart of case studies. And so often when we do, particularly our project interventions, it was years and years of pulling teeth, trying to get people to look holistically, to look at what else was going on in the context of the intervention that might influence the extent to which this intervention achieves its outcomes. This is so important, and at least I'm very glad that now the DAC and its standards is recognizing the importance of context. You have to know who the major players are and what they're doing, what else the government is doing in the area in which you're working. Understanding the context is all important, and case studies are excellent for doing that. But if you can't say that you've done this, if you can't say you're doing this, maybe you don't have a case study. But all is not lost. All is not lost, because when you can't say that you don't feel that you can meet that definition of a case study, but you think that you're pretty well partially meeting it, you're using the principles of developing a good case study design, then perhaps you have what is called a case-based approach. Not a full case study, but a case-based approach is much better than not having one. And it strengthens your design. And that design is all important to convince people of the soundness of your methods. It strengthens it if you can say, well, I use case-based methods. So at one extreme, we have fly-throughs, right? That's the least good methodology. Sometimes maybe you have to do it, but you don't want to be there on the fly-throughs. On the other side of this continuum, we have something called ethnographic research or ethnographic evaluation. And let me give you an example. Most of us will never be there. So I like to talk about Margaret Mead, who was a great anthropologist and did a lot of ethnographic research. And Margaret Mead, some of you may remember her, she had many books, very popular during her life. One of the issues Margaret Mead got interested in, she was US-based, was this issue of adolescence in girls and the coming of age. And she found all her women friends who had young girls were talking about how difficult their children were, how they were always in angst. They had the high emotions. They were quick to flare up. Happy one minute, terribly depressed the next minute, and how difficult this was. And so Margaret Mead wanted to know, is this something that's just true of the United States, or does this hold across cultures? Well, she went to Samoa to find out, and she stayed in Samoa for 3 years, and actually married a Samoan while she was there, and thoroughly studied this issue in Samoa. So she met with lots of women and their daughters, and she found out that actually coming of age in Samoa is a beautiful time when a girl becomes a woman, and it's celebrated and it's joyful, and there aren't these ups and downs. So I'm not saying that you have to do a case study, you have to spend 3 years in country, for sure. But When we're talking about ethnographic research, then you're very in depth. So actually, I like this example because it also shows some of the power of case study. Case studies cannot always prove that something is conclusively, but it can prove conclusively that something isn't with an N of 1. So Margaret Mead found out that in Samoa, right, if all this angst and all this turmoil was not true, was not the case. And so with just one case in Samoa, Samoa being the case, she disproved her hypothesis that all over the world, in every country of the world, this is that young girls go through this turmoil and angst and period of fast and high-flowing emotions. So case studies with an N of 1 have the possibility to absolutely conclusively address a generalization and to say, no, this is not true of all countries. Absolutely clearly. So most of us will be somewhere around here as we talk about our case studies. We won't be in the world of ethnographic research. We may be able to do a comprehensive case study that really looks at something in its entirety and in its complexity and look holistically. We may feel that we can't be there, and maybe, but we can improve our methodology by using some of the methods of case studies. And sometimes I'll use case-based and case studies interchangeably. I want to talk, and I know I'm spending a little bit of time on this slide, but I think it's important. In one of the references that I'll be giving you at the end of this presentation, there's a book by Stake. And Stake, Robert Stake, many of you know him as a grand old man of evaluation, is famous for his work on case studies. And his books are often classics on case studies. And in one of his books, he has you start, which is a reference, he has you start at the end and actually read his case study, and then go back to the beginning and understand how he arrived at the conclusions that he arrives at. And he is one of a team of evaluators. They're evaluating 8 sites, I think it is, in the state of Illinois. And he has 10 or 12 days at that site. And I think that in 10 or 12 days, he does an incredibly convincing case studies. Some of my students challenge me on that. They don't agree. But I think he does a pretty good job of understanding, in this case, what early intervention of a school reform legislation looks like in the particular school in which he was assigned. So sometimes, you don't need a lot of time. Sometimes 10 to 12 days can be enough for a good case study. So when I talk about a classic case study and how they're done and what you want to do, they always involve a holistic view. They're trying to understand this intervention in all its complexity, in its context. So to do a case study, you have to know what else is going on, how this intervention may be interacting, how other policies may be affecting it. So if you're doing agribusiness and you're studying the effects of a policy, the aim is to increase agricultural land for farming to help meet the country's needs for food, lower their imports. You have to look at other policies. You can't call it a case study without doing that. Maybe there's a housing policy that has the totally opposite objective, and its intent is to convert farmland into housing developments. So you have to know what else is going on, and what, particularly in our world of development banks and donors, what else is going on? And it's not just other UN organizations, it's other development banks. Maybe the ADB is really important in this instance because they're a major country for the ADB. And too often we neglect the world of foundations, which are very, very important to look at. And you've got to know all the major players to have this holistic view. And I think now to meet those DAC criteria, you also have to do this. So case studies are also all about descriptions and what they call thick descriptions. Thick, in-depth, and some of you mentioned in-depth in your comments. And it is in-depth, it is thick, rich descriptions and understanding. Something that is maybe not so understood is this principle of relativity. So in case studies, not so much maybe in a case-based approach, the evaluator says, I am viewing this through my eyes, through my lenses. I'm trying to be objective and to see it, but I know that as an individual, I carry all kinds of biases and don't always know when they're happening. I decide in my evaluation what really the story is, right? There is an element of storytelling, which was also mentioned. And I'm deciding what is important to my main message. What is my main message here? And which views maybe are most pertinent to that? And whose views are most important? I'm not taking everybody and giving them equal weight. I may think that the words in the school setting that Steak was in, that the views of the principals are more important than the views of the parent committee, which isn't very well attended and isn't really functional. So I may downplay their views. I may give more weight as I tell my story to that of the principal. Now, this is a different view because usually, right, we want to be objective and all data are equal and all that. But in case studies, you decide really which views, which data, which information you're going to give weight to. You see it through your own lens. And in case studies, we're pretty clear about that. Case studies also use something called progressive focusing. So you try, as you go along, you're trying different hypotheses out, and you are maybe disproving them as you go along and tossing them out. So the problem with the issue of school reform, you may say that at first, after you've been there, a few days, you may say, well, I think the problem is that, the principals and the teachers are not taking the school reform, they're not taking it seriously. And I'm going to put that out as a hypothesis. If I have other people collecting data in other sites, I might say, I think this is going to be an important strand. because I'm finding sort of immediately that maybe, it's not used in the daily curriculum, and the principal isn't plugging it all the time. And I think maybe there's an issue here of people not taking it seriously, sort of ignoring this school reform legislation. And then as you continue collecting data, maybe you decide that's not the case at all. They all know about the school reform legislation, and they know about it. They think it's important. But in this particular situation, in this school, which happens to be low income, poor, in the middle of urban Chicago, in their apartment ghettos, it's not a matter of not wanting to implement the legislation. It's that they're so focused on just discipline, on getting the kids in their seats, ready to focus on learning. And that takes a lot of priority. They have a lot of disruptions, disruptive kids, they have gang issues. And so over time, you're focusing in on what you think is the true issue here. Doesn't mean you don't have a plan. Doesn't mean you haven't set out your evaluation questions. What it does mean is that you're going back. Sometimes you're modifying the theory of change. Sometimes you're adding new questions based on what you're finding that you didn't originally have. And that's progressive focusing, and that's very much at the heart of case studies. Throughout the case study, you're searching for patterns. Are you getting the same story as something emerging from the Parent Teachers Association, from the board advising the principal, from the parent committee advising the principal, from the teachers, from your observations of the school itself, its cleanliness, absence or presence of graffiti, what happens before school, what happens when the kids change classes. You're looking for patterns that are saying, yeah, I'm getting closer to it. These things are complementing each other. When we set up these hypotheses, it's called developing assertions. Some people call them propositions. I sometimes call them hypotheses, but assertions. You're saying, I think this is it. And then you're doing what you can to try to reject them, to try to find them not true. And it's only if you cannot reject them that you feel comfortable saying in the end, all these sources are pointing me in the same direction. I'm finding patterns. Okay, so case studies have not been in good repute. And it's because of something that happened in 1966 and still sometimes haunts case studies. And it's a little thin green book, probably all of 35 pages, but it sets the stage for all evaluations. Campbell and Stanley's groundbreaking book, Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Research. And in this little green book, this publication, which became the Bible for evaluation, they said the one-shot case study was found to have such a total absence of control as to be of almost no scientific value. With a conclusion at the end, they said, it seems well nigh unethical at the present time to allow case studies of this nature. And it just did in case studies for a long time. And even today, we have vestiges of this, right? We have, when we speak of the gold standard, we speak of experimental design. And it's true that the best method really for an evaluation question, to address an evaluation question, well, it depends on the question being asked. It's not always experimental design. So in 1975, Campbell apologized and reversed himself. The reason for this is, as it says, that it's our only route to knowledge. You can't reject naturalistic observation. It's not to say it's not objective, that it's always objective, dependable, or unbiased, but it's all we have. So what does he mean? It's our only route to knowledge, noisy, fallible, and biased though it be. Think about anything. Think about how you learn. Those of you who have children, how do children learn, right? Children don't have to touch, they learn about hot stoves, and they don't have to go around touching a whole lot of hot stoves to learn that it's something that you shouldn't do. Right? I love this slide of Michael Patton's. I don't have to jump out of an airplane without a parachute to know that it might be hazardous to my health. Right? We learn all through our experiences or hearing about others' experience. That's how we learn. We form naturally these hypotheses or propositions or assertions, whatever you want to call them. We form them and hold on to them until something happens to change or modify that view. So we learn, not all stoves are hot necessarily. Sometimes they're cold and they're fine to touch, but I should be careful until I know whether the stove is on or not on, because I could get burned. Right? So we modify, but all our learning, when you think of it, either it's from your own personal experience, or you've seen or heard other people talking about it, and you've picked that up from your experience. You've heard of accidents, where parachutes not opening and the conclusion is not pretty, right? So this naturalistic observation and generalizing on the basis sometimes of one experience is how we learn. And we reject that proposition when other information comes in and tells us, no, that is not a universal truth. Yes, let me say, Deborah, we do triangulate, and that comes under, we'll be talking about that a little bit under analytic methods. And you're absolutely right. The evidence, how we weigh the evidence, depends on triangulation and what else supports, and how many different sources or different people support this view, because we're always trying to reject it. So we'll talk more about triangulation in a bit. Okay. But right now you're collecting your information and trying to form your propositions or hypotheses. So now case studies have had a resurgence. And the reason for that is so many times an experimental design can be a great method, but sometimes you want to know much more about why, and perhaps why I may have an overall positive result, but maybe it's really uneven across my sites. And that experimental design isn't going to answer why questions very well. So as we have understood more and more the complexity of evaluations, after all, most of our experimental designs take place on a limited basis. They're only true of the sites in which we're conducting those experimental designs. So if you think about it, we don't have a big basis, even when we do an experimental design. If we only have picked one site out of 1,000, we don't have a good basis for generalizing it. It could be context specific. And as we recognize the importance of that context, we understand that we have to ask a lot of questions about an intervention, and that attribution of outcome may not be the key evaluation question. It may be more why our gains are so skewed, why they're really just at one end, and maybe it gives an overall positive effect, but we want to know more about why it's not evenly spread, for example. Okay, and so I think I've talked about this. The why questions are so important, and case studies are just excellent at answering why questions. So, and I've talked about the DAC criterion of coherence that also supports the use of case studies, because that's how you get at it. All right, so we're going to talk more about this in case-based approaches. So this is case study, but also think case-based. Case studies are super at addressing why questions. You know, why are we seeing this particular pattern? They're good at answering how questions. They can be used to address what questions. They're not good at all. You shouldn't use them for answering how much, how many, or to what extent questions. For that, you probably want a survey. And sort of who, where questions they're not good for. There are 3 main uses of cases in evaluation. Now, you may be doing a case-based approach. I don't quite need, I don't have the time for what I think would make it a legitimate case study, but I'm going to use these principles. So I have a case-based evaluation methodology, and I'm going to write about that in the objective scope and methodology description of my report. So one of the things you first have to decide is whether you're doing an exploratory case study or case-based evaluation, a descriptive or illustrative case-based evaluation, or an explanatory case study or case-based evaluation. So exploratory, the exploratory is a good basis to use this kind of approach, where you don't know. And it may be like the example I just gave, where they selected 8 schools in Chicago in the state of Illinois, 8 schools, to explore what early implementation of this state school reform legislation looked like. Now, you could try to do a survey right off the bat of all the schools in Chicago. There are lots of them. But in a survey, you have to be very, very narrow in your questions, very specific in your questions. And a lot of times you don't know. When they started this, they don't know what the issues are. They don't know if there are different issues in different types of schools. So they did the 8 schools to represent different types of schools in Chicago. So doing these case studies help them understand what some of the issues are, at least in one, whether they differ across 8 sites, whether they seem to be any pattern in terms of the key reasons for differences. So case studies help you. Once you have that information, you can much better design a survey. They're very, very good for understanding what is going on in something like early implementation. Case studies are great, and most of us associate this kind of descriptive approach with case studies. So In this case, you may say, I'm doing the case, picking my cases. I've done a survey. I'm doing a country evaluation, but I'm picking 3 sites within the country, there's 3, to develop a better picture, an in-depth picture of implementation of this intervention. So I can talk about all the issues involved in this implementation of this intervention. And I can look at the context. I'll probably look at different contexts, maybe 3 of the same contexts, but I want to be able to provide some in-depth description. I want to bring my numbers to life that I got in the survey. Explanatory is our 3rd use of case studies. And they actually do address causal questions all the time. Under what circumstances was this intervention successful? Under what circumstances was it not under what circumstances does it equate to not successful? Yeah. I want to develop a very detailed understanding of the cause and effect relationships in different contexts. The issue with case studies often is whether you can generalize from them. There's no issue about causality. You can be absolutely convincing and convinced that because of your approach of searching for patterns, of forming assertions and trying to disprove them, the richness, your understanding of the context, you can be absolutely convincing that you understand the outcomes, and in this situation, how they were achieved, and that it was this intervention that achieved those outcomes, and how the context did or didn't play a big role. So we'll talk about types of approaches. So here I have some examples, and some that I just picked out some time ago. Here, when you want to do an exploratory case studies, when you don't know much about the intervention or its potential outcomes. And here they wanted to look, in this case, they didn't know how much, they have their legal protections, but what is the role between African customs and children's protection? How does that interact with the rights of children? And so they did an exploratory case study. And in our work, it may be appropriate to do this kind of case study. Descriptive, right? We add realism and in-depth examples. And in this case, the Asian Development Bank did a study where they just told storytelling of people whose lives have been transformed through the reforms. And they wanted the richness, the in-depth. Probably wasn't the only kind of evaluation they did, but they wanted to have this rich information. They wanted to have people tell their stories about how they felt they were impacted by certain reforms. And then there's explanatory. The example I have here is old. It's there's some things about it that are very dated, but overall, it looks to explain the program's effects, and most often the contextual factors that influence them, that they're trying to explain the success or the failure of the intervention. And typically in an explanatory case study, we may pick we may do multi-cases. So very often we put all the, whatever are here, it's locations, we might put them into 12 baskets by socioeconomic status, by minority representation, by urbanicity versus rural. We may decide that 12 baskets pretty much fit what we want to do, what we want to show. Now, it doesn't mean that you can generalize from these 12 locations to all 1,000 that are out there, but it does give you information that is strong about these 12 locations and whether they were successful or failures in terms of the intervention and why that was. And that can help you then develop information to see if these findings are true, if they hold across a broader sample. But they can be very true. You can feel that at least in these 12 locations, you can explain the outcomes and what led to them and to what extent your intervention had a role. And this was an example on 12 locations of they gave vouchers to help with home ownership, and they wanted to know what worked well and what wasn't working. So designing the case study or case-based approach is very important. And your first issue is whether you are dealing with a single case, you want multiple cases, or you're trying to do a comparative analysis. So a single case can be appropriate. Margaret Mead, when she was in Samoa, was using a single case, and she was doing a critical test of an existing theory. Only takes one to make you throw out that theory or hypothesis or proposition. So a single case is okay when we want to study in depth, maybe a causal process. It may be enough to call into doubt sort of our whole intervention. And we may have to go back and see, test our assertions and see whether they hold in more sites. Because in this single case, we show conclusively that it wasn't our intervention that caused these outcomes, or our intervention never got to these outcomes, and what the reasons were. Multiple case studies, that's 2 or more. We use these often when we want to compare we want to look at what's typical. We want to look at maybe extreme cases. So maybe we have a lot of survey data and we want to look at the best performers and the worst performers. And those are great reasons for multiple case design. The more you can describe in your OSM, your objective, scope, and methodology, what type of case study you were doing, whether it was exploratory, descriptive, or causal, whether you then used a single case, multiple cases, or comparative cases, the more you can describe, the stronger your methodology, the more convincing it will be to people. In comparative case, we start out with the idea that we are going to be comparing. We're going to be making comparisons across sites. Here in multiple cases, we're talking about those that were very good, those that were very poor. We're describing each. not really comparing. Comparative cases, we try to choose sites that are representative, not statistically, but sites that are representative based on the set of sites that we have and their characteristics. So usually we don't want, if we're doing comparative analysis, we don't want more than 12, but we want more than 4. So after 12, it gets pretty unwieldy to do. I have seen bigger ones. Once is involved in looking at special education legislation, and there, I think we used SRI International, and we looked at like 22 school districts that we felt were representative of all the school districts in the US. Statistically, no, can't say that. But what we are doing is picking them to represent one type of school system in this case. And we're systematically comparing and contrasting. That means if we're looking for patterns across contexts, we have to really make sure that we're asking the same questions at each site. We want uniformity if we're going to seek to compare them. So usually we have our hypothesis, and then within it, we want to maximize the variation of cases along this. So, I'm interested in special education, that's my theme. I have, 150,000 school districts, and I'm going to be picking 12. I'm going to be trying to put all the school districts. I may not know for a while that 12 will work. I may need to play with that a little bit, but I want to compare and contrast across these 12 types of school districts that are differ on key characteristics having to do with special education. This kind of case study we use frequently, and we do use it to explain. We are looking for those patterns. We're triangulating across cases. Gets used very often. There's approaches that we're not going over today, one called CQA, Comparative Qualitative Analysis. It's a very structured approach, uses Bayesian algebra, but it's sometimes used. That's a subject for a little webinar in itself. Okay, so single case, can be exploratory, typical, critical instance, or explanatory. You want to use this kind of language if you're doing a single case. Decide what is its use. Multiple cases we may use for bracketing, what's happening at extremes, best cases, worst cases, looking at clusters, how do they compare with each other? We may try to be representative of different variations. And often we use that for descriptive case studies. Comparative, not the same as a multiple case study, because we want to maximize heterogeneity, and we're structured. We need structured data collection for that. Theory of change is important in case studies and case-based approaches, important to all evaluations. The difference with case study or case-based is that as you do your data collection, you're analyzing at the same time. You don't do, in case studies, you don't collect data, you're done, and then you do analysis. It's an interactive process. And as you start to find patterns of difference or patterns of similarity, this may affect your theory of change. You may go back and revise it. What you thought was your theory of change may not hold. And you may have new questions that you want to ask within all your case study sites. If you have patterns of convergence, you're pretty clear. They say, why don't you add a case as a critical test of that causal explanation? If you have a lot of differences, add a few cases to refine your causal explanation. But again, you're cycling back in case study or case-based approaches, you're cycling back, and you may have to revise that initial theory of change. If you're doing a comparison, what are the key patterns that occur over time? How can you explain similar or different patterns? And what might be responsible for those patterns? Bounding the case. In any evaluation we do, we bound it, right? So we always say, this is the time period we're looking at. These are the number of sites we're looking at. But in case study, boundaries, setting the boundaries, defining the boundaries are sometimes more difficult because we are dealing perhaps with concepts like communities and studying 5 communities. Well, what's a community? What are the boundaries of the community? How are you going to define that? It can be much more difficult to bound the study. So you're going to have to think about it, think about your questions, and think about your time, your space, your activity, your population, the parameters. The boundaries have to be explicit. So again, QCA is something we have a question on it about, what I think of it. I think it is something that the average evaluator won't do. Right? It's complicated. It's not easy. And I think you have to, if you're going to do one, if you want to try one, you're going to have to hire someone like Barbara Buffani to help you through it. You're not going to be able to do it on your own. And certainly, Angeline, case study can be used as a standalone approach, or it can be used in combination with other approaches, particularly some kind of survey or document analysis of all cases. So also in case study, often our approaches are nested. And so we have to think about which is our unit of analysis. So, we could be defining it when we have cases where it's sub-regional level, country level projects. And so we might have in Turkey, 3 sites that we're going to be looking at, Lebanon 1, Uganda, we have 2 projects, Ethiopia 3. What units of account do we have to consider? Are we just at the Horn of Africa? Which countries are we selecting? Which projects are we selecting? And on what basis? So here, some of our criteria might be, this was a World Bank example. What's our position here? How important are we? How big an effort do we have compared to our partners? We might have very specific questions that we are starting to address. So maybe we only have 1 site here to address where we're really looking at displaced people, refugees, returnees in depth. Maybe though for this policy question, we're going to look at more sites to look into financing needs and capacity. We have multiple, or in case studies, we want multiple sources of information. So interviews with partners, interviews with refugees, interviews with those who represent the refugees, government, what else are they doing that might influence this project? document analysis, portfolio analysis. We want multiple sources of information. And data analysis, Robert Yin, which is another book I'll talk about later, is an excellent resource. Robert Yin's books on case studies, his central book is now, I think, in its 7th edition. And he has a whole chapter on developing the case study protocol, which is really important. We don't have time to go in today, but it guides everything. And if you have multiple people doing the evaluations, then it's so important for this protocol to cover everything they need to ask, what to do in different situations. And it helps to facilitate triangulation, because as was pointed out by one of our participants, triangulation is at the heart of case study or case-based approaches. Triangulation and the strength of those findings, how well they triangulate, is going to determine the strength of your evidence, particularly for making causative arguments. So this slide is an example of one that's sort of close to your hearts. It's about UNESCO and 3 questions they had. I think we're going to address this more in a future webinar, so I'm not going to address it now. Again, this slide is just showing how iterative your conduct of case studies is. And I don't have time to develop it. The protocols, it's everything, your theory of change, your questions, your approach, all this guidance, your templates. If you're looking at records, your templates for data recording, all the different instruments that you use, your guidance for within case analysis, and might be cross case analysis, and how you want things written up. Again, Yin has a whole chapter on this that I encourage you to read. Case studies can leverage information, bring a comprehensive set of data. You might be using lots of these approaches. And the more that you use, the more you're getting the same picture from each type of data collection tool. The more you're getting the same picture, whether it's supportive or refutes your hypothesis, the stronger your case. So you want to use multiple methods. You can also do random sampling, as I mentioned before, absolutely no reason. This was one study that was done by the Asian Development Bank on the impact of cost-shared water supply services. They picked 29 small towns, or they had 29 small towns where the project was implemented. They did a purposeful sample. We don't have time today to talk about sampling for case studies, but they picked out what they thought was a representative sample of 10 out of the 29. It captured the differences in geographic locality and access to water sources, and was representative of the range of pipe water supply coverage. Right? So within these 10 small towns, they used random selection then to select the households in each of these 10 small towns that they were going to talk to and study until they got their desired sample size. So you can definitely use random sampling within a case study. This slide is just, again, showing the iterative process of case studies. Let me talk a little bit about analysis in the time I have left. Triangulation is so important. And you want to be able to triangulate data that you've collected using different data collection methods and instruments. You want to be able to triangulate against different data sources. So the sources might be, well, let's go back to the school example. It might be teachers, it might be pupils, it might be the principal, and it might be records or source. Data sources are where these data reside. and which of those you used. Right? So checking to see across my sources, am I getting the same picture from the principal, from the board, from the teachers, and from my observations, because we tend to use a lot of observation in case studies. Does my information, does it confirm? And when I go across the different sources, that's my first step. I might have investigator triangulation, you know, so that it's not just my bias. Is this being found by other evaluators who looked at other sites as well? And the more I can triangulate and get a clear picture, the stronger my evidence. So in a study that I did for NORAD, you know, their basic question was, does anybody use our evaluations? Well, we talked to people, we ended up with a descriptive evaluation. We looked at the best, the most used, the least used evaluations that we got from people's opinions. They did a survey of all the people in NORAD and how useful do you find NORAD's evaluations. So we had survey data. We did an analysis of whether they wrote up their reports well, how difficult, easy to understand were they. We did a citation analysis. How often were any of their evaluation reports cited in the literature? We had, and then we went in depth into the 4 case studies, I think it was, that we picked. So at the end, we had all these sources of information to bring together to answer our questions within site and then across sites. And that's the heart of case studies. Being able to do that can give you a lot of strength in confirming or disconfirming the extent to which your intervention affected the outcomes. So I would like to have a session, a webinar just on coding, because coding is how you find this out across all your sources. You've got to have a code. You've got to take everything you've used, interview transcripts, literature, project documents, observation notes, everything. And usually going in, we have a set of themes or concepts that we think are important. And then we also read through, maybe we read through every interview we've conducted and ask, are there other themes that are coming out that we didn't think of at the beginning? But boy, they sure seem to be important, and we better add them to our analysis. And we then have a set of codes, and we've got to go through every interview, every piece of data that we have using these codes. And we can do our analysis by hand, or we can do it with the help of a computer package for coding, like NVivo, which is the one I use. Usually you don't want 1,000 categories or codes. They say 8 to 12, and then you may have subcodes within them. I've gone over that 20 total code number, though, I have to admit. So this is a whole session in itself. It's the way that you have to deal with all your data in order to find out that question of how well it triangulates. And I really recommend a session on coding. It's good to try it by hand to understand how the software packages can help, but you've got to input the information into those software packages. It's not automatic. Okay, so within and cross case analysis, this is pretty much just the same as what I've already said. You want to do content analysis. Generalizability, it depends. Strength of the theory, strength of the evidence supporting the theory, strength of the evidence from each step of the causal chain. And you want to look at each step of your causal chain to see whether, we only have weak inferences, or you have strong inferences, where you can set out, yes, I believe that this intervention caused these outcomes, and I'm setting it up as a proposition. I've tried to disprove it, and it stands. And I think because of that, I'm going to put it out there as a generalization, and perhaps other people will add their knowledge to it, help disprove it or disprove it. The more you have selected heterogeneous cases, the more you have a convergence of patterns across different contexts, the more you have a convergence of patterns with existing literature, existing evidence. For example, we know a whole lot about parent involvement in schools as strengthening children's learning. The more you converge with those already established patterns, the more you can feel comfortable generalizing from case studies. All right, so I am out of time, and I will turn it back over to Francesco or Carlos. I'm sorry this has been so rushed, but I hope that out of this, you at least have the key principles, and you can strengthen when you use case studies, you can strengthen them. When you now can also say that you use case-based approaches that strengthen your approach and methodology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. It has been a very rich but very interesting presentation. There is a question in the chat, and thank you, Linda, for having responded to the question as we went along. I mean, I don't know if you may want to respond to it.
Yeah, Angeline, I think you can use case studies as standalone method, certainly. And probably in most of what we do, though, we use it in combination with other methods, but absolutely you can use it as standalone. How do you judge if an approach qualifies as case-based? I think that you have to determine yourself whether or not you really are comfortable with saying that you looked at this intervention holistically and within its context, and that you believe that you have a pretty good idea of that, and that you followed the principles of case studies. You describe your sample, how you got to that sample, you describe your methods. The more you can, in your OSM, say that you follow the principles of case studies and you say what those are, then the more credence your study will have. In a way, it's judgment, your comfort level, whether you have a case study, a case-based approach, or simply some site visits. And you have to decide and be able to defend your choice. Sort of start with some site visits that you've done. And then you have to look and say, what were those criteria for doing case-based? Do I have a rationale for what I decided to select? Can I maybe broaden my methods in order to be sure that I have a case-based approach? These are the references that I recommend, and Stake Book, Yin Book, and one on embedded case study methods, just so you understand some of the complexity.
Thank you, Linda. So maybe at Taipei, maybe we can launch the other Menti.
Okay.
Just one more questions in the chat, in case they can be interesting.
Okay. I think that you can apply the criteria. I see the question Shandy is asking. It's a good point. I think that you have to look at your case certainly to decide whether it meets enough of these principles of case study design to be a model of a case study that you want to use as a case study evaluation. So yes, it's intertwined. But there are other principles for how you write it up that we haven't touched on.
All right. Well, with that last question, we'll move back onto the website we used earlier, menti.com, and see whether after this presentation, you have slightly changed your mind or adapted some of your thoughts, or whether you still believe it's the same principles that you already believed in. And we'll go back to menti.com and see if you still think of the same keywords when we discuss evaluation case studies. So same principle as before. You can put up to 5 words each, and you just type in the keywords that come to mind when you think of evaluation case studies. Black swan.
Black swan.
Interesting. Okay, we see in-depth has come back. We have some of the keywords that were mentioned, the types of case studies: explanatory, exploratory, descriptive.
Mm-hmm. Good. Context. I like that one. In-depth, descriptive. Mm-hmm. Protocol.
It's interesting. So we see some of the words have come back, but there are also quite a number of new words.
Where is triangulation? Narrative, causality. Mm-hmm. I like the protocol came up there. Complex is big, explanatory is big. Gets mentioned a lot of times. Multiple data sources, great.
Yes, so thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. It's interesting always to see the before and after, how some of it has changed and some of the keywords that are come back. Explanatory is very present. So I suppose maybe that means a lot of our colleagues here use that type of case study or are particularly interested in that type of case study. But thank you for your participation in this session, and thank you, Dr. Linda Mora, for the presentation. And I'll pass it back to Francesca, to close. Thank you.
Thanks, Taipei. Yeah, I'll just close very briefly by thanking Linda again for this extremely rich and insightful presentation. Thank you, Linda, for this food for thought, as well as everyone that joined us today. Just a reminder that this webinar is part 1 of a 2-part webinar series, and part 2 will be held early next year. And will be more of an interactive discussion among UN agencies around experiences, lessons learned, but also challenges in the use of case studies in evaluation. And we will announce the date of this second webinar soon, and we hope to see you there. Thanks again, and then have a good rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are.